السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله رب العالمين، صلاة والسلام على محمد النبي الأمين وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. أما بعد, Islam in America have went through different phases and different stages. And once in a while, you will hear from this corner or that corner a new trend, or at least an attempt for a new trend. In the old days, in the beginning of the 20th century, it was the concept of the black Muslims, where basically tens of thousands embraced what's known at the time as the Aqidah of the Nation of Islam, which have nothing really to do with the Islam of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And there was at the same time a Sunni Islam path that was totally separate. But on and off, we heard of attempts to mold Islam in America and even in the West in general within a certain perspective that fits certain agenda. For example, at one point in the 1990s, there was an attempt to establish a school to graduate imams. It's called the School of Islamic Social Sciences. And it was explicitly mentioned that this school aims to discuss issues that are of importance to American government. That basically has to do with jihad, status of women, freedom, and so on and so forth. And that's why the term at the time was used that those guys are calling for American Islam. And this term was not invented at the time. This is a term that Sayyid Qutb, may Allah have mercy on him, put it in a Risala article in 1951. So at one point, there are some people in New York who try to apply the hudud. And at another point, we have communities' main concern is the halal and the hilal. The halal food and the hilal of Ramadan, the issues, and the mortgage. So we went through different phases as Muslims. And once in a while you hear, as I said, something coming from this corner or that corner. So keeping, inshallah, with what's going on and being aware of these issues, we would like to tackle one of the issues that's being there. And some of you might have heard some glimpses of it here and there. So Brother Hassan Baloch will talk about new traditionalism in Islam in the West, Orthodoxy, spirituality, and politics. So inshallah, hopefully, pay attention to get, inshallah, the understanding.
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira. So this is a book review about this book, as Brother Sham mentioned the title, Neo-Traditionalism in Islam in the West, published July 2023. The author, her name is Wala Qusay. She's a professor. Currently, she's at, I believe, the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. She has a doctoral degree in philosophy from University of Oxford and has studied many other places and taught many other places. But essentially, I think this is her first book, and if I think of it, probably may have been her doctoral dissertation. As Brother Hisham knows, that, many times the doctoral dissertation becomes like a book. So your advisor tells you, go ahead, publish it as a book, add a few more things. So I think this is probably, my guess is the case, because it's her first publication. But the reason I became interested in this book and why I wanted to review it was because much of the time we find certain scholars, and it's as if you're trying to corner them to say something about Gaza, or say something about the Muslims in the world today, or say something, and each time you have to go after them, and they make maybe one comment, but otherwise the generality of their discussion is completely divorced from reality of what Muslims are facing. And so it was a curiosity of mine to think, what are these people, their mentality, what is their philosophy, why do they come on this pathway or trajectory? And to learn from that, and also to see where some of the pitfalls of these kinds of thinking and these movements are. So this book kind of very dovetailed into that idea. She starts the book with a transcript of dialogue between Sheikh Hamza Yusuf and a man which some of you may know, Dr. Jordan Peterson. He's a psychologist in Canada, and he became very famous and notorious in right-wing circles as well as in Canada itself because of his refusal to basically address certain people who are identifying as transgender by their pronouns that they want to be addressed by. And then furthermore, he became really very staunch right-wing sort of conservative, in essence, basically one of their favorite philosophers. And he started to talk a lot about the feminization of men, meaning men in Western societies have become more deliberately feminized, and other topics. So, but in essence, they start off with their discussion. And, as a right-wing sort of thinker, what she's emphasizing in this first introductory article, or the chapter, is that Sheikh Hamza Yusuf is trying to show that Islam and right-wing conservatism is compatible or even connected together in many ways. So one thing he mentions, that Islam is not anti-capitalist, and that conservative Western values have a symbiosis with core Islamic values. And he said that Islam is concerned with preservation of property, which he quoted a Western thinker as saying the last metaphysical right is the right for property. And they both emphasize their fear for decline of Western civilization by the decline of religion, the decline of social and gender distinctions, and the decline of the sacred as a marker for civilizational collapse. So, so you can see the positioning there, that there is a push to try to connect ourselves closer, or Islam closer to the conservative party and conservative worldview. They say that, he said furthermore, Hamza Yusuf, in this talk, that religious worldview deals with privilege. And if you don't have religion, then all you're left with is resentment and envy. In other words, a sort of Marxist resentment and envy. So he's saying that religion has a very important part to play in modern society to give people a perspective without which, they will be lost in terms of their identity. So some topics, not to discuss in too much detail right now, but just to give the point that this movement, neo-traditionalism, which she goes on to define, has in the modern era really tried to connect itself very closely with right-wing conservatism, or of recent years. So the basic outline of this book, and by the way, this book is free online, it's open access, so if anybody wants to read it, let me know, we can give you the link for that. She identifies three figures that she considers to be emblematic for neo-traditionalism. Then she also did, and I think this is what her doctoral research was, for over 6 years, she interviewed 40 people who attended these rihla. This rihla is like a spiritual retreat that maybe some of you are familiar with. It happens every year, and these three figures are prominent in this rihla. And the three figures, she'll go on to talk about them, but also then there are political dimensions of quietism. So there's a Christian philosophy called quietism, which then became a political philosophy that people talk about. And they even organize Muslim thinkers into different categories, and one of them is quietist. And the quietist is the one who believes basically that one should not really talk about politics or at all. It's sort of like they don't have an opinion one way or the other, they just stay quiet about any political matter. And that came from a religious philosophy of Christianity. Certain Christians were quietists. In other words, they weren't preachers. They didn't preach to other people. They just kept their ideas to themselves. It's a kind of posture in Christian philosophy. So they are kind of the Muslim quietists in a sense. And so what is the political dimensions of that? So the three figures that she did kind of a mini biography of, and to also examine their views. First, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, then Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad, and then finally Sheikh Umar Farouk Abdullah. Basically, these three, as she said, form an orientation in Anglo-American Islam that emphasizes the primacy of tradition and sees a moral and political impairment in its resurrection. And to their students, they represent a connection to religious tradition. So that's why she said they're traditionalists. She said but they're neo-traditionalists in a way because they are in the modern era, so obviously they have some new aspect of them. So that's why the term neo-traditionalist. And their assertion, these neo-traditionalists, is that Muslims have always belonged to one of four madhabs, and that most Muslim scholars also belonged and were connected to a Sufi tariqah of some kind. And so they have this model of traditionalism. And they present traditionalism as an antidote to modernity. And so they have as part of their project that you have to unlearn modernity and to learn their thinking. So we're going to unpack some of their ideas, but before I go into that, she spends some time talking about the differences in the British and American Islam experience. And I thought those were interesting. In Britain, post-World War II, there was a mass migration of people to alleviate war shortages. And there was an act, the 1962 Commonwealth Immigration Act, and it facilitated this mass migration. And those immigrants were mostly laborers from South Asia, and they tended to be segregated into communities. Whereas America, Islam in the US was first and foremost grounded in black history and culture. It started, as she outlined, that there was an Ahmadiyya movement that gave da'wah to the black community. They had this personality of Wallace Fard, who became and started the Nation of Islam, who then preached to a man named Elijah Poole, who later became Elijah Muhammad, and the Nation of Islam. And that tradition of Islam through that aspect of black history and culture is a very important difference in American and British Islam. And then in 1965, there was a similar act in America called the Hart-Celler Immigration Act, and it basically abolished immigration quotas from Asia and South Asia and South America. And so it allowed mass immigration and led to many of us, our parents, coming to this country. And the immigrations, though, were by and large professional, urban, Sunni, more affluent and more educated than the average American. So there was a little different aspect of who came to this country as well. And she mentions that in the 1980s, there was Islamic Dawah movement, which was funded through the Gulf and Saudi Arabia, Salafi Dawah. And she says that these neo-traditionalists, they talk a lot about Salafism because they say that there was a Salafi burnout. A burnout of many people who were in Salafism who then basically burned out of it and had nowhere else to go. And if anyone, she goes into a brief history of the Salafi kind of schism and what happened during the Gulf War. But in essence, We had some Salafi scholars, Sheikh Salman al-Awda and Safar al-Hawali, who were part of this movement, which later became called the Sahwa movement. And they challenged the permissibility of having U.S. troops in the Jazirat al-Arabiya, and also this alliance with the U.S. And for that, they were imprisoned. And from that, there was a schism among the Salafis themselves. There was a counter movement, which we now know as the Madkhalism or Madkhali, after Sheikh Rabi' al-Madkhali, who said the opposite, that khuruj an al-hakim is impermissible. So going out against the ruler is impermissible even if he's tyrannical. So in essence, she outlines this only to show that there was this other counter movement that basically lost steam. And in the 80s, the late 80s, we have these three scholars who came in the picture. Many people went to study in the East, but three definitely stood out from this group. And they came back and they started establishing institutions in the West. The first personality, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, she gives a little bit of biography, so I think I'll go into that. His father was in the oil business and was very wealthy. He was Orthodox Greek, but his mother was Catholic by her birth, but basically essentially became a Buddhist. And she was believing that religion was largely arbitrary. And so she even took him to a mosque when he was 12 years old. And age 16, it was in the late 70s, so he was exposed in the Bay Area of California. There was a large amount of people interested in Sufism, not necessarily Islam, but the idea of mysticism and Eastern philosophies. There were Sufi dancers and singers that performed at Grateful Dead concerts, for example. Grateful Dead was one of these very popular rock bands. And so there was this kind of intermixing of this kind of ideology. And at age 17, he almost died in a car accident, so he had some kind of religious transformation. He met a couple from Mecca that were living in Santa Barbara. They were followers of Abdul Qadir as-Sufi. This is another gentleman who is interesting as a character. He's also originally white British, I think, or maybe Scottish, sorry. And his name was Ian Dallas, and he became later known as Abdul Qadir as-Sufi. He had Moroccan Sheikh Muhammad ibn Habib, and he became a muqaddam of this Shadili Sufi order, Habibiyya Darqawiyya. But anyway, he was a very prominent figure at the time when Sheikh Hamza Yusuf was young, because he was someone who mixed in with a lot of celebrities. He mixed with, like, for example, Eric Clapton and George Harrison and Bob Dylan. These are all famous singers of that time. And he ended up making a Sufi lodge in London, a Zawiya. And he started, it became like a kind of attraction for people to visit. And later on, he made a first pure Muslim village in Norwich, in England. And so Hamza Yusuf, at age 18, he dropped out of college and he went to this community in Norwich, England. And he started living there. It was there where he was contacted by Emirati scholar Abdullah Ali Mahmoud, who convinced him to study in the UAE. And he studied for 3 years at Islamic Institute of Al Ain. And from there, he met some Mauritanian scholars and eventually was connected to his sheikh today, who we know, Abdullah bin Bayya, who would later become his sheikh. In 1984, he terminated his relationship with Dallas. Dallas had since started this movement called Murabitun, World Movement. And so he terminated his relationship with him and he moved to North Africa. And he lived in Morocco, Algeria, Mauritania, and there he met another one of his sheikhs, Murabit al-Hajj. And eventually he came back in the late 1980s to the US to become a nurse. And it was in the early 90s where most Muslims became aware of him through talks at ISNA conference. And that's where he sort of became almost a celebrity. So that's a little bit of his biography. Sheikh Omar Farouk Abdullah is also, he's a white American from Nebraska. His parents were academics. His mother had a master's degree, taught at the University of Missouri. His father taught organic chemistry, a professor of organic chemistry. He also was in a car accident, had some religious experience, kind of a parallel with Sheikh Hamza. He studied English literature, almost got a PhD in that, but then transferred to a PhD program instead at the University of Chicago, where he studied under the famous teacher Fazl ar-Rahman. And he studied Arabic and Islamic studies and got his doctorate in Maliki fiqh from University of Chicago. And from then he started teaching in various universities, and eventually he went to Spain. And why did he go to Spain? The same movement, Murabatun World Movement, which was, we talked about, Sheikh Ian Dallas, who was leading that movement. He had moved on from Norwich because that part had collapsed, and instead he started a new community in Spain. So he joined them there. So she goes into some detail about this Murabatun World Movement. I think it's important because it does get a sense of like the cult-like nature of some of these things. And he said he chose husbands for his female devotees. So every one of his female students, he would choose them husbands. And he ordered male disciples to divorce their wives. This is Ian Dallas. He would regulate all aspects of the lives of his followers. As one attendee said, we temporarily lost our minds, when we lived with him, meaning that they allowed him to do all these things, controlled them in this way. And eventually, Sheikh Omar Farouk Abdullah, he said he split with him when Dallas told him that there were no Muslims today who truly understood Islam. And this is an important idea because it does come up a lot in these same kinds of circles, is that at some point or another, they do end up telling their followers that nobody else understands Islam except for us, and that's a kind of a common phenomenon. But nonetheless, he left there and he moved back to the United States and started teaching in Chicago. He founded the Nawawi Foundation, which is defunct, but he continues teaching, and in fact, he takes bay'ah from others as a Sufi scholar. He's the only one of these three that takes bay'ah, basically. And he teaches annually at this retreat called the Rihla, which is, again, where she did her research. And lastly, we turn to Sheikh Abdul Hakim Murad. He's also Caucasian, but British, and he was born Timothy John Winter in 1960. His father is a very famous modernist architect. If you Google his father, you'll find that he's has a lot of different examples of his modernist buildings and structures, and he has a very big name in the modernist school of architecture. And so he grew up in that household, and he went to Cambridge after going to an elite private school, and he learned Arabic. His primary interest in learning Arabic was to get a good job in the Gulf because there was an oil boom and he wanted to move there. And he moved to the Middle East, and he briefly joined Tablighi Jamaat. He studied in Al-Azhar for 3 years, and he studied informally with sheikhs in Saudi and also from Yemen. There's a movement of Sufis in Yemen, the Ba'alawi, of which he also studied with them. And among them, Sheikh Habib Ahmed Mashhur al-Haddad. And he returned to the UK again in the late 80s. All of these people returned around the same time to the West. And he started publishing in his journal called Q News, which there was a man named Fuad Nahdi who founded that, and he will come back again later on. So they became famous, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf in 1993 in Isna, and I don't know if I went to that Isna or many of these Isnas in a row, but when you would go there, those of us who went to those Isna conferences, his talks were like sort of sold out. He was like a mini celebrity there. He became very famous after those ISNA conferences. And after that, he started a series of other programs called Deen Intensive and Light Study programs and the Rihla program, and ultimately founded Zaytuna College with funding. She says from Iraqi philanthropist Hisham Al-Alusi, but of course funding is one of those things which maybe Brother Hisham can also comment on the funding. Yes, so many people say UAE has funded this college, but so $50 million. So the funding, anyway, is debatable as far as what she said. But anyway, but all three of them, they met together in 1999 and they developed a loose coalition. So it's not just she picked these three people randomly. They also have worked together extensively and they have similar ideas. And so in their same cohort, there's Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, Nuhamim Keller, Zaid Shakir, Umar Farouk Abdullah, Abdul Hakim Murad, and another Nigerian scholar in Britain who many of you may not know, Ibrahim Osi Ifa. And then from them, they have the next generation. You had Sheikh Osama Kanan, Yahya Rodas, Omar Qureshi, Faraz Khan, Asad Tarsin, Abdullah bin Hamid Ali, Mustafa Davis, etc. And in the UK, they had their students, Faraz Rabbani, Afroz Ali, and so on. And ultimately, they claim to derive their legitimacy from their sheikhs from the east, meaning namely Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya in Mauritania, Muhammad al-Yaqubi, Habib Ali Jifri, Habib Ahmed Mashur al-Haddad, the Ba'alawi sheikhs in Yemen, and Sheikh Murabid al-Hajj, also from Mauritania. But that is the hierarchy of this kind of movement. So one of the, I think, best parts of the movement is really their critique of modernity. And I think that's one of the things that I've benefited the most from some of their lectures is looking at the philosophical underpinnings of modern life and critiquing how wrong modern thinkers get it and how Islam can address this problem. So what they say is that modern world is disenchanted. This is a word that Weber uses, a German philosopher. And he says that basically the modern man is no longer connected to the unseen, meaning that in the past, humans used to have a porous self, a self which was open to external experiences or supernatural experiences. And the modern world made people disenchanted, and so they no longer have these types of experiences, or rather they're less open to them. And basically the denial of metaphysics or spirituality or some higher view leads to a kind of relativism. So everything is relative, and which ultimately means that there's no meaning for anything. Nothing is meaningful. And so when you don't have any meaning, then you have a loss of a crisis inside yourself. Many of them, especially Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, he compares the modern Islamic situation to the Protestant and Catholic conflict. And so the way, and his formulation is interesting. He says that the Protestants are like those people who said we need to go back to the Hadith, and we don't need to, we don't need these scholars to tell us what to do. And he says that and he blames the Protestant Reformation for secularism. He says that people, this is his quote, people say Islam needs a reformation. He said, no, it doesn't. The Reformation was a bloody war between Catholics and Protestants. Protestants saying go back to the Hadith. Islam doesn't need a reformation, Islam needs a restoration. And so in this case, as you can see, he's transposing his movement as Catholics, the modern day Catholics, and the Muslims of modernity, who he is criticizing as the Protestants. And in fact, he identifies with many Catholic stances, but that's a different matter. So what they said is a society without metaphysics, without a connection to the supernatural, is one that will die away. And the main feature of secular age, and they're quoting Charles Taylor, he has this book, A Secular Age, is the loss of transcendence. Meaning that you don't connect yourself to anything higher than yourself. You're just in the modern day reality and without any connection to anything higher. And he said that today, the modern age it's really the age of authenticity. He says where humans have to liberate themselves from the shackles of a socially constructed reality and recreate an authentic human being in its own absolute and immaculate conception of what it means to be a human or a person. Meaning that every person in the modern age, they're told there's no reality, there's no truth. You have to construct your own truth. You have to try to find your own identity. You have to find the true self, who you are. And every single person has to do this. And every single person is trying to be their most authentic self. Who are they authentically? And ultimately, he says, this is Sheikh Hamza, that you get caught in a cult of individualism, you become trapped in materialism, and you constantly need to actualize a meaning about who you are, and it leads to a crisis of your identity itself. And so this critique of modernity is really, by and large, what these neo-traditionalists spend most of their time talking about. And they criticize Muslim learners. They said that colonialism caused a crisis and a Muslim response. This is their conceptualization. They said colonialism caused a crisis, and it led to Muslim seminaries, meaning the schools like Al-Azhar and etc. They introduced modern sciences into their curriculum. And this quest for scientism replaced ethical concerns. And so instead of using their scholars for guidance, they disconnected their scholars. They said that they are blameworthy for emphasizing spirituality and otherworldliness. And so they dismantled traditional religious structures. And they were pushed to the side. And a new kind of professional Muslim or Muslim intellectual was born. And so this is their critique of what happened in the colonial era. And their chief villain for them is Sheikh Rashid Rada. And they identify him because he combined modernity with traditional Islamic sciences to challenge a lot of different concepts that the West was coming with and infecting the Muslim world with. But they say that this was, in fact, his methodology introduced Western thinking into Islamic thinking and changed Islam itself in a way, leading it away from traditionalism. And they also blame him for his ideas leading to the creation of the Muslim Brotherhood. And they said that he turned Islam into an ideology. And they give as an example of Abu Dhar. They said Abu Dhar radiallahu anh, he said that they reframe him as a Marxist figure, fighting for the poor, meaning the framework is oppressor and oppressed. And it does not allow for a metaphysical view of existence or tribulation. In other words, they say that Islamists have transformed Islam into a predatory force, making it a refuge for angry youth who use it as a political platform to rage against the injustices of the West. And they say that it has turned religion into an Islamist, Marxist totalitarianism. Islamic angst to achieve uniformity and unity is similar to a Marxist bid for equality, and it turned Islamism into a type of totalitarianism. So in essence, there's a lot of words, a lot of different concepts there to unpack. But what he is saying and what they are saying, and definitely Sheikh Hamza is talks more about the political realm than the other two. The other two, their ideas on this are much less well known. But he is basically saying that when you have oppression, when you're oppressed, your colonialists were in charge of large parts of the Muslim world. The Muslims were oppressed. He said they should have responded by declaring that this is a tribulation and turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and just understand that this tribulation is from Allah and it's because of our sins and we need to be patient. Rather than what they did was they tried to alleviate the oppression by creating different movements against colonialism and against the Western imperialist powers. He said they shouldn't have done that. They should have rather just accepted this as a tribulation. And because they did these other things, they have corrupted Islam in different ways. This is his idea. This is what I'm just conveying his idea as he's stating it. And he said this is similar to Marxism in the sense that because Marxism fought against capitalism, it had ideology, it had a kind of extreme, because Marxism thought that there was a battle between the workers who are the source of production and those elites who are basically exploit the workers for their production. and that this battle between these two is, it needs to be resolved. And the resolution of that was that there is no communal property. So that was kind of a totalitarian vision. And so that's why he's comparing these Muslim movements to that, in a sense, because they are also comparing a sort of idealized Islam against the West, and also trying to create a utopia or some kind of resolution which will be similarly in some kind of idealized fashion how Marxism views the world that was going to be. So that's why he's comparing it constantly to Marxism. But in essence, we get back to the point that his viewpoint, and this is why you see it over and over again. When somebody asks Sheikh Hamza a question about politics, he goes in circles and he talks about the world is unjust, and we are living in this world is a world of injustice, and don't get near the rulers, and then he says this and that. And at the end of the day, he doesn't have any vision for what you should do, because ultimately he gets back to this point that this is, you need to see yourself as being afflicted by a tribulation, and you need to be patient, and you need to find what your sins are and look inward and try to fix those sins. But your job, as he put it in another chapter, is not to fight against oppression. Your job is not to fight for justice. It is rather that inward struggle. And that is his conceptualization of what Islam is. So, I don't know if you wanted to say anything about that, but yeah, inshallah. Yeah, so the book continues because it talks about phases, because there's pre-9/11 and post-9/11. As you know, she talks about the fact that in England, pre-9/11, there was a lot of, the Labour Party was reaching out to the Muslim community a lot. And they allocated funding for Islamic schools. They passed religious anti-discrimination law. They even had a Hajj delegation that the government was going to back, a Hajj yearly, or some kind of Hajj delegation. They developed a recognition of equality gap. They were looking at the fact that Muslims were being discriminated against. All of this was pre-9/11. And there's an organization called the Muslim Community of Britain, MCB, I think that's what C stands for. It was the main body that was representing Muslims in England at that time, and the Labour government was working very closely with them. They have no significant radical views. They basically, if you go to their website, you'll see that they're just about integration of Muslims into England and preservation of their rights. That's all. But after 9/11, they didn't go as closely as the government wanted with them into the Afghan war effort, and so it damaged the relationship. And so there was also these July 7th, there was a series of train bombings in England in 2005. And after that, there was a change in the government strategy altogether. They no longer worked with the MCB. In fact, they started to find other people that they could work with, and they created a new strategy they called PREVENT, preventing violent extremism. In short, in England, you'll know it as PREVENT. And they wanted to create a British version of Islam. And they said, who can we work with in this job? They found two parties that they could work with. One was the Quilliam Foundation, which was a think tank, which was anti-Islamist, founded by ex-Hizb ut-Tahrir activists. And the second was the Sufi Muslim Council. And one of the members is a very notorious fellow, Sheikh Hisham Kabbani. As those of you who know about him, he was at one time very popular in the US around the same time as Sheikh Hamza started becoming very popular. But at some point, he alienated the entire Muslim community because people realized he was working very closely with the CIA and the State Department. And he told them that basically 80% of Muslims in this country are extremists. And he said 80% of the mosques are extremists. So everyone who worked with him became very, suddenly realized that he was nothing more than an agent, and his popularity definitely diminished. But in the UK, he still was part of this Sufi Muslim Council. And there was also another movement called Radical Middle Way. And if you remember, I told you about Fuad Nahdi. He was the one who started this newspaper that Abdul Hakim Murad originally sent his articles to. And he is the one who founded this movement, Radical Middle Way. They said they were inspired by Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, so by his call for a new alliance of virtue. So he's, of course, talking about this alliance of virtue, which the Prophet ﷺ he praised before Islam, which happened in Mecca. And so Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya has been talking about we need a new alliance of virtue, new hifth al-fudul. I think that's how you say it. The government spent a lot of money. They gave this movement, the Radical Middle Way Project, up to 1.2 million pounds over the course of a few years. And so they spent a lot of money trying to create these new Muslim movements and new Muslim that they could work with. And interestingly, as you see, they identified these neo-traditionalists as people they could work with. I'm not going to go into, and you can read, some of the middle parts of this book are about her interviews with people who attended these spiritual retreats and kind of biographies of them. In essence, they came to these retreats for all sorts of reasons, but they wanted some kind of authentic experience that they couldn't find in modern life. And so if you look at these retreats, they all are sort of either they're in the East somewhere, they're in some kind of Eastern Muslim country, they're located in a space where they feel like it will create a spiritual connection to the past, and so that's part of the experience. But what they found, and I'll tell you some of the things that these people would say, is that they found that the neo-traditionalists, they put on one side this kind of pristine Islam that they've learned, and on the other side they put this cultural contingent immigrant Islam. They said that we, Europeans who became Muslim and studied in the East, we don't have the baggage of colonialism. And so these other Muslims who are coming from the East, they have the baggage of colonialism, so they cannot be trusted, or their Islam is not as pure as our Islam. This is kind of what they're implying or teaching directly. And even though, of course, many of the people grew up in Muslim countries, they studied a lot with religious scholars, they grew up many times in religious, very strong educational systems, and many times they even studied with traditional imams. And so they warn of these neo-traditional scholars, they warn of these doctors and engineers who are out here teaching about Islam. But the real difference is not really what their training is, because even some of these sheikhs, they have studied engineering and doctoral and medicine. The real difference is what she says is that how they view traditional authorities. The professional is skeptical of traditional authorities, and the neo-traditionalist views the traditional authority as the key and needs to be followed as a chain of tradition. And in these spiritual retreats, we find some people who had problems with them. Among them were the African American Muslims who attended these, because they were told they were very insensitive to any African American issue. And the fact that Islam itself in this country came to stand against oppression of African Americans and what they experienced. So they were totally dismissive of that in these kinds of retreats. And in one of them, this person, he said he heard him say himself that Islam in America will be led by white converts. He said that this is something they said explicitly. And so there is a kind of racialization of these movements as well, although it's not formally talked about. And you find that because you find in this Reviving Islam conference in Canada, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf came out very strongly against Black Lives Matter. And you said, why would he do that? And so you find again, the same ideology is driving that kind of principle. That he doesn't believe in this fight against oppression. And he says that you need to look at these leaders and that tribulation itself it leads to a kind of resentment, and that resentment leads you away from true Islam and understanding what tribulation is about. So in essence, again, another anti-political statement, even particular to the American society. So that's why some of them ended up moving away from that movement as well. Other problems they talked about, she talks about the rihla itself, these spiritual retreats, and the problematic nature of the women that attend these retreats. She said many of the women, and she's interviewing women herself, so she's a woman, and she's saying that they're falling in love with the imam, and so this is a very common phenomenon. And then they said that the leaders, they tried to control the women, and one of the senior students told her that your relationship with the sheikh is like you're married. He's like kan nikah, just like marriage. And he has to know everything about you. And he has to tell you everything to do. Marry or divorce or anything, you have to consult with the sheikh. And so it became one of the people that was creeped out by this. She said, this definitely was not what I learned about Islam, so I left that movement. But there is this sense of a cult-like phenomenon where people are told exactly what to do. And unfortunately, the male sheikh and female student relationship becomes problematic. So, again, talking about their viewpoint, he says that Muslims see themselves as victims. Victimization is a defeatist mentality. It is a mentality of the powerless. And we believe all suffering has a redemptive value. Meaning that just because you are, being oppressed, or you can't see yourself as a victim. You say that this suffering it has a redeeming value, and he says, he gives the example of the Mongols. He said when the Mongols came and they attacked Baghdad and destroyed all what they destroyed, the people, they looked inside. They didn't look. They looked at what they were doing wrong and didn't blame the Mongols. And he gave the example of the Syrian revolution. He says the Syrian people, they would chant, the Syrian people will not be humiliated. He said now all these poor people are begging non-Muslims to let them into a country. And he said if you humiliate a ruler, God will humiliate you. This is what Sheikh Hamza Yusuf says in 2016 lecture. So again and again we see the same basic viewpoint, that the position of the Muslim when he faces oppression or when he sees oppression, it's not any activist approach. It is meant to be just spur inward self-reflection and some kind of inward process without any outward effect. And I'm going to fast forward to perhaps a little bit about their connection with politics. In 2014, so although they say they are not connected with politics, or they advise people not to be connected with politics, or they advise you that you need to turn inwardly, they have a lot of connections with politics themselves and political figures. In 2014, there was a forum in Abu Dhabi called the Forum for Promoting Peace in Muslim Societies, and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf was there speaking. And this was just a few years after the Arab Spring. And so the context is important. He says that from the duties of the Muslim Ummah is to respect the leader, and as long as they do not compel you to drink wine or kill a human soul, you should obey them. And he said our Salaf used to say 60 years of an unjust ruler is better than an hour of anarchy. And at the end, he shook his Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya and kissed Abdullah bin Zayed, and he left the stage. And this was less than 4 years after the Arab Spring, when the UAE had spent so much strong intervention against the Arab Spring and Muslims and what they fought for. I wanted to contrast that with Sheikh Jawdat Said, rahimahullah. He was, anybody who doesn't know Sheikh Jawdat, he was one of those famous figures in Islamic history, traditionally very strong Islamic science background, knowledge, Circassian originally, studied at Al-Azhar and other places. But he became very strong in the idea that Islam needs to spread nonviolence. He became very strong against coercion. So they thought he would be a good person to bring in to give an award. They said, the same forum, they said, next year we want you to come and accept an award for nonviolence. And he said that He gave a long response, but he refused the award. He said that the jurists, they legitimize coups against democracy, legitimate rule, and the consensus of masses in one place, while they claim to be supporting legitimate rule in other places. He says, I apologize, I cannot accept, and I will not be attending. What he's saying is that on the one hand, they're telling you, listen to your ruler for 60 years. But on the other hand, there's another ruler, Dr. Mohammed Morsi in Egypt. They're working hard to depose that ruler. And so he says that on one hand, you have your ideology where you're saying you should obey the ruler. On the other hand, when the Muslims elect or they give their opinion and they want a certain rulership, you depose that ruler. So what is this? This is ideological failure, bankruptcy. And he says, so I cannot accept this award. So, you know, the idea that there is no political element to what these people are about is kind of a falsity. And it becomes even more stark when you see these kinds of contrasts. And they are people who have worked very hard connecting themselves with governments and politics. And in fact, they changed their ideology. You know, they said people who knew Sheikh Hamza back before in the early 90s or early 80s, they said he was almost like a white Malcolm X. You know, he had this kind of mentality. But he changed, at least that's what they say, they changed some of his philosophy, and now we have what we have today. In 2003, RAND and the Nixon Center, these are two conservative think tanks, they had reports. The Nixon Center had a key note conference. They had the two people that were there, Bernard Lewis and Sheikh Hisham Kabbani. We talked about him earlier. Bernard Lewis, famous intellectual Orientalist in the West. For him, all parts of Islam are problematic. But they joined together and they made this one statement. They said, Bernard Lewis says, there are poems by Rumi and Ibn Arabi which indicate basically that all religions are true. They have the same purpose, the same message, the same communication. They worship the same God. It's not just tolerance, it's acceptance. And Kabbani immediately after that talked about how Sufism is the only thing that can be amenable to secular citizenship, and he contrasted it with inauthenticity of Islamism. And just to give you a short idea about how many different conferences and lectures and programs have been doing to try to connect this idea of Sufism and neo-traditionalism as being really the form of Islam. Yeah, I'll just give you a few of these conferences. Amman Conference, 2006. A Common Word Between Us and You, 2007. This was a document that was printed. The Mardin Conference in 2010, European Anti-Terrorism Conference. Who are they? The followers of Sunnah. This was in 2016 in Chechnya. Famously, the Salafi scholars, they were angry they were left out of this conference. The Marrakesh Declaration, 2018. Document on Fraternity of World Peace and Living Together, 2019. Abu Dhabi's Declaration of Inclusive Citizenship, 2021. Universal Ideas in Combating Extremism by Asserting True Islam. You know, these things have been going on for the last 15 years, maybe longer, and they have been trying to basically create this form of Islam where you are not worried by anything that happens in the world. There's the Radical Middle Way project we talked about. They had a conference, ILIS in Gaza, 2008, the first Gaza invasion. And they said that people were hoping that the shuyukh, and remember the Radical Middle Way is one of those movements where all of the three of the characters that we talked about, Abdul Hakim Murad, Sheikh Umar Farooq Abdullah, and Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, they combined together. This is the only movement, thing that they have worked together on, this project. He said they all came together in 2008 and they were hoping for some kind of strong statement about Gaza. And they said that when we were younger, we were taught that speaking out against corrupt ruler was the best jihad. They said this was now inverted. They said speaking out against the ruler causes fitna, and even if the ruler is evil. And he said that made people quiet. And said people were despondent because the message we got was this bad. There's nothing you can do about it. Politics is for the people of dunya. We are the people of akhirah, and so on and so forth. And so, my dear brothers and sisters, this was the issue with this movement. Although it claims to connect with traditional authority, and it claims to represent traditional Islam, it has some very odd and very strange ways of looking at the world. It tells us that we should stay quiet in the face of every oppression. It tells us that we should be not focused on any political matter. And it tells us to do all that while at the same time they have a political agenda that they advance constantly throughout the world. And that agenda, of course, is nothing more than a neoconservative agenda to dominate the Muslim world. And so this is the problem with this kind of movement. And even to the point that Muhammad ibn Abdul Nayaf, Muhammad ibn Nayaf was one of the Saudi's princes. He had a think tank, and he says he published an article, I'm trying to think article's name. It was basically about the UAE's conspiracy with Sufi movements and the danger and implications for the security of Saudi Arabia. So in essence, even they were realizing this was a neo-conservative political strategy involving these people as a kind of tool to create a new kind of Islam in the world. And for them, the UAE and their partners, every form of Muslim is a radical. They submitted about 80 different organizations that they declared terrorist in the West, including the Muslim Council for Britain. We talked about the principal movement, or the organization that represents all Muslims in Britain, including MAS. They put MAS on that as well. And CARE. Well, CARE and CARE and ISNA, they tried to declare them terrorists in the US as well. There was actually legislation from one of the conservatives. Yeah. So all of this is to say that they consider all of us to be the most extreme people, and that only they know the true Islam, and that Islam is some kind of Islam that they think is where you stay quiet about every injustice, and it's unnatural. It is as if you're telling somebody who's suffering next to you and you're not supposed to speak about the suffering. It's as if we had a massacre in Gaza today, in Rafah, where 20, maybe who knows how many people died. Children were beheaded by bomb, and the one they want to tell you is just, stay quiet. This is a kind of tribulation. Of course, it's a tribulation, but what do you do about it? That's the main point. What is the action that you take about a tribulation? And if you have a sin, what do you do about it? So you stay quiet, or what is the sin that you're actually being punished for? Is the sin you're being punished for being quiet and not standing up for people who are oppressed? So they don't identify what is this sin, and even it's very superficial, their conversation about the topic. I know Brother Hisham has maybe some things to add.
Jazakallah khair, Brother Hassan. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala highly reward you. Let me just say a few points. Throughout history, there are many attempts to derail Islam, and many attempts to bring a change from outside or sometimes from within. And this is the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah will preserve it. There is no doubt about it. For us, this is not really our issue. This is not something that, starting tomorrow, this will be our issue. No. We just need to be aware of what is going on around us. Some of you might know, before September 11, as Dr. Hassan mentioned, Hamza Yusuf was very famous, and he will give talks against the US. And when September 11 happened, the FBI went to his house because they want to question him. And his wife said, he is with the president in the White House. He said, what? They were going to question him about a lecture he did against the US. And his wife said, he is with George Bush in the White House. They could not comprehend it. And of course, all of you who watched the speech of George Bush declaring war in Afghanistan and this, they saw Hamza Yusuf sitting in the chamber. And from that point on, there was this turning point. In fact, one of the outrageous statements, I have not heard anyone who have any Islamic credentials, and Hamza Yusuf does have Islamic credentials, talking about that the Masjid al-Aqsa can be shared with the Jews. I mean, outrageous. He was asked after the Gaza He said, you know, how about building this temple? Of course, we have talked about this, that the Zionists want to destroy the Masjid al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock and build a temple in its place. And when he was asked about, you know, he said, this space is quite large, meaning that it can accommodate, you know, the Zionists in this regard. Now, why he's saying this? Because that's what the UAE, his masters now, they are the ones that are his masters, because he brought Muhammad ibn Bayya, who's a famous, you know, Sufi-oriented scholar, to the UAE. Now, listen to what when Brother Hassan mentioned the countries that are having those conferences: Jordan, UAE, and Morocco. This is where this Islam has been manufactured. And Hisham Qabbani is a criminal. There is no doubt about it. His beard is like half a meter. When he used to go to those conferences in Los Angeles, you know, one of them, you have those young women, as what Hassan mentioned, put their hair on the ground, and Sheikh Qabbani will step on their hair to bless it. This is the Sheikh Qabbani. Sheikh Qabbani was called into the State Department to give a talk. The video is there. So he told them that, you know, those MSAs, they will be bringing a bomb in their suitcase from Osama bin Laden, and they will have a mess in the US. And there are 80% of the Muslims in the US are extremists. 80% of the masajid more extremists. So he told the State Department, you need to give us the money, and we will be the ones who controlling the trend of what this Islam be in America. So he's offering himself for, you know, for sale. And there's no, you know, secret that Hamza and company got tens of millions of dollars from the Emirates. And they, you know, he came once from the Emirates to Canada in a lecture attacking the Islamic movement left and right. And of course, people were outraged. What's wrong with you? Of course, he came after getting the $50 million from the Emirat. The second day when people talked to him and said, you know, the impression is this and that, he came and said, I was tired. I heard those lectures. I was tired and I was not really concentrating on this and that. Make no mistake, this movement is strongly connected to the Republican Party, the right-wing politics in this country, and they are having a plan. At the same time, they tell you don't talk about politics. And they sleep with the politicians, quote unquote, the American term. They sleep with the politicians and they tell you don't talk about politics, just be patient. So the people of Gaza and the Ummah and this and that, be patient. Let the Jews do what they want, let those Zionists do what they want. Be patient, because this is a test from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect this Ummah and protect this deen. And inshallah, we will talk at length about Gaza next week, inshallah, between Maghrib and Isha. Jazakum Allah khair for being patient listeners. I know the level of discussion that Hassan have done is really not familiar to many in the audience in this regard. But before I close, I have a question. Would you rather have this class on Sunday or Tuesday? Those who would prefer Sunday, can I see hands? Sunday. How about Tuesday? Okay, Sunday wins. Inshallah, we'll see you next Sunday. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.